In the next 1 hour, we hope to learn a lot about how India can leverage from emissions trading experiences in the Asia Pacific region. And for sharing the knowledge, we have with us Professor Shrikant Gupta, a highly accomplished expert in environmental economics. Professor Gupta is currently a visiting senior fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress and executive education senior fellow at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He has over 30 years of policy and academic experience, and his illustrious career spans teaching at globally renowned institutions, including the Delhi School of Economics, the National University of Singapore, the University of Maryland, and IIT Delhi. Prior to his academic career, he has also served as an environmental economist at the World Bank and has contributed to key policy committees for the Government of India, UNEP, and IPCC. So please, if you could, it's okay, you could just take the chair. Okay.
I'll stand for the first.
Okay. Joining him in today's conversation is Mr. Kaushik Deb, our Executive Director. As an applied economist for over 25 years of experience, he has a distinguished career as a strategic advisor to governments and corporates on policy, markets, equity, access, and technology developments. Before we proceed, a quick brief on the work that researchers are doing in using market-based mechanisms to mitigate air pollution. EPIC India has been in the forefront of working in energy and environmental research for over a decade. One of our flagship initiatives is the emissions trading scheme, which we launched in Surat in 2019 in collaboration with the Gujarat Pollution Control Board and JPAL South Asia. With its success in Surat, then extending to Ahmedabad, we hope the ETS will slowly expand to other parts of the country, and it'll be a blueprint to balance sustainability with development. Today, we'll delve into Professor Gupta's insights from his recent paper that talks about how ETS in Asia and Pacific remains a progress, but can also be a learning lesson for the rest of the countries who is either wanting to start or wants to implement the emissions trading scheme. Following the discussion, we'll open the floor to questions if you have any towards the end of the talk. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome you once again, sir, and hope we have a very interactive session today. Thank you.
It's really an honor to be at EPIC India because EPIC India has, as was mentioned, been pioneering market-based instruments. And Professor Greenstone, Professor Rohini Pandey, your predecessor Anand Sudarshan, all of them have really done some fantastic work in emissions trading for particulate matter. And I'm grateful to Kaushik for inviting me here. First names, because confession, one of my earliest and most brilliant students from the Delhi School of Economics. So my work also actually, in a way, predates what EPIC India did. So when I came back to India from the World Bank a couple of decades ago, the Ministry of Environment had a task force on market-based instruments for pollution abatement. And I was sort of part of the task force when I was at NIPFP. And we did some very interesting work, but things have been, simmering since then. And of course, now EPIC has done some very good work in this. So what I'll do today is maybe just spend 15 minutes at most, Kaushik. I have a lot of slides, but I'll try to skip through them fast, and maybe you can help me with the time. So basically, so the slides are not here, or can I? Okay, here. Okay, so I need the mic. There's a mic here. Right? Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today, or what we are going to be discussing today, is sort of propelling Asia, using Asia Pacific knowledge to propel emissions trading. So what you see on the screen here is a background paper that took almost, I think, 8 to 10 months to write. And it's carbon pricing to emissions trading in Asia and Pacific. So I am really talking about emissions trading in the context of greenhouse gases, largely carbon dioxide. So this background paper was written for the ADB, and this was their flagship report calling Catalyzing Finance and Policy Solutions, which was released at the recent COP29 at Baku. So some of the large parts of the elements of the paper that I worked on fed into this report. So what I'm just going to say here is, firstly, trying to contextualize emissions trading. So emissions trading, as was mentioned, EPIC has been doing work in India. And there has been a lot of work on emissions trading, or if I may just want to call it carbon trading, around the world, and particularly in Asia Pacific. So in the Asia Pacific area, several countries such as China, New Zealand, and Korea, and several more have been implementing emissions trading or GHG trading, or whatever you want to call it. And this is a very important tool for GHG mitigation. Emissions trading, of course, is not a new idea. It's been around for a very long time, but its sort of use in GHG mitigation has been more recent. So here is a summary of the paper in a way. So just to give you the context. So what we do in this particular paper is we look at national and subnational emission trading systems in Asia Pacific. So the countries that so it's quite interesting actually that if you think of how you regulate, how you use economic approaches for GHG mitigation, there is carbon taxes and carbon trading, or which we also call emissions trading. But what's very interesting in the Asia Pacific area is that many more countries are using emissions trading rather than carbon taxes, and we can discuss that. And sometimes they, of course, use a combination of both. So the countries in the region which are actually using some form of emissions trading are Australia, Indonesia, Japan, Kazakhstan, New Zealand, China, and South Korea. So of all the countries in the world that are using emissions trading, a large number of them, about 7 out of 12, are in our region. And of course, the European Union emissions trading system is the world's oldest and largest by value when it comes to GHG, or carbon trading. And the takeaways, there are these following 4 takeaways, that each system that we see in Asia Pacific has its own unique characteristics. But there are some common challenges, which again are no surprise. So for example, limited sectoral coverage. Not all sectors are being covered. The price signals are a problem. If you have too low a price, then obviously it's not a signal, it's not an adequate signal for people to invest in carbon mitigation. And then, of course, there are issues related to monitoring and enforcement. The jargon for that is called MRV. Is people familiar with MRV? Somebody is nodding their heads. Monitoring, reporting, and verification. How do you monitor the emissions? Are they being reported correctly? Are you greenwashing? So these are fairly obvious, that unlimited sectoral coverage, weak price signals, issues related to monitoring and enforcement. In this particular paper, there's a deep dive into the 4 systems that are long-standing. The one in Indonesia is very new. In Australia, they don't have a full-blown emissions trading system. The Kazakhstan one, so these 4 are the countries which really have sort of the most detailed data. Japan is mostly voluntary. So what we do in this paper is we do a deep dive. So I'm not going to take you all the things in the paper. They are in the slides, and you're welcome to look at them. What we do then is we recommend policy measures such as clarifying the long-term objectives of the ETS. Why do you want to do emissions trading in the first place? Is it for greenhouse gas mitigation? Is it to stimulate investment in green technologies? It's very important to know what is it that you want to do. Broadly, of course, we want to do this to achieve our net zero goals in different countries. So it's very important to be clear about what your long-term objectives are. Also, you have to have tighter caps. The limits have to be fairly tight. Otherwise, the prices are going to be low and there won't be enough of an incentive to reduce the emissions. Administrative capacity for MRV, it was already there on the screen. And then complementary policies to mitigate the distributional impacts of carbon pricing. So this is a very important point, that in most of these countries, and particularly when we start talking about this as the implications for India, there will be distributional implications, because obviously when you have emissions trading, carbon pricing, meaning end use such as electricity and so on, will go up, and that will have some distributional implications. So how do we soften the impact of that? And our final finding was, which is again very obvious, that there's nothing sort of final about the systems that are existing around the world. Even the European Union, which has had emissions trading since 2005, is still work in progress. So all of these systems that we are looking at, particularly in these countries in our region, they're all still work in progress. So in a sense, it may not be very fair to even say that, they're not working well or whatever, because there is constant evolution. And despite that, though, I mean, there are important lessons for India. So I think in the discussion, one important thing is, what are the takeaways for our country? In our country, the state of play obviously is that we have passed the laws, but it's still very far from implementation. So in a way, it's a good thing, because if we want to probably learn from other countries, learn sounds to sort of, I don't know what to say, but it's more like, what are the takeaways? What can we imbibe from the good practices and the bad practices, right? Sometimes you learn from best practices, but you also learn from worst practices. So too many slides here, so I'm just going to I don't want to go through all the jargon here, but not neither the history, but I just give you 2, 3 slides to give you the context. So when we're talking about emissions trading, and as I've already said, EPIC is working on local pollutants like particulate matter. The United States has probably one of the most successful trading programs for SO2 acid, which causes burning of high sulfur coal, which emits sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain. So that's been a very successful program. Here I'm only talking about carbon pricing. So now you can see, as I've said earlier, there are carbon pricing is carbon taxes and carbon trading. And as you can see that there are a fair number of them around. And just to give you 1 or 2 headline numbers, as of now, about more than 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent are emitted every year, and about 12 gigatons are under some form of pricing. So roughly speaking, almost a quarter of the CO2e, meaning CO2 and other gases, are being regulated through some sort of carbon price, either carbon taxes or carbon trading. And a lot of the emissions trading systems actually are subnational. So for example, China had pilots, and the most successful example of subnational systems is in the US. I'm again now only going to talk about greenhouse gases. I'm not talking about local pollutants such as particulate matter and so on. And like I said earlier, the interesting thing about this region, the Asia and the Pacific, is that 6 of the 12 nationwide ETSs are, and these in the parentheses are the years they were started: New Zealand, Kazakhstan, South Korea, Australia, China, pilots in this, nationwide, Indonesia, Japan is voluntary. So you can see that countries such as New Zealand have been at it for a very long time. And maybe we can discuss more about, specific countries. As you can again see from this graph, that there's been a rapid increase in the total number of carbon pricing instruments, which includes taxes and trading. If I just want to go to the emissions trading, you can see that, that from a very small number, now almost 18% of all greenhouse gases globally are covered. And obviously, this big jump, as you can see, is when China started its own national ETS. So obviously, given that China emits so much of greenhouse gases, that when China's system comes into play, so by the amount of GHGs regulated, obviously China is the biggest. But since prices are very low, in terms of the value of trading, the EU is still the very biggest, is the biggest. So I'm going to skip through all of these things. And again, I just want to perhaps maybe just give you this takeaway, that as of now in the Asia Pacific region, the volumes are small and the values are low. and they're relatively recent, barring some of these countries which have been at it for a while, and that the sectors committed of the sectors covered are fairly limited. Uh, but it's like whether you want to look at the glass half full or half empty. So yes, a few sectors are being covered, but power sector is an important sector because that's the one that uses most fossil fuels and accounts for 38% of the total emissions. So that is almost always covered under ETSs. Uh, the China is not an ETS per se, it's a tradable performance standard. So what's being regulated is not the actual emissions, but emissions intensity, that is emissions per unit output. So a benchmark is set and you have to reach that benchmark. But as you can imagine, in emissions intensity, the numerator is emissions, the denominator is output. So it's emissions per unit output. That's what is being regulated. So it has its own interesting problems. We can discuss them later, but prices are relatively low, as you can see here. And again, economists like to talk about the social cost of carbon, which is very high, like $100 per ton or something like that. But right now, the prices are very, very low. So I would term the I would term it as a proto ETS. So these are not like real ETSs, but these are proto ETSs. Uh, I think I should skip. So as this is just to give you a flavor of the months and months of toil that go into writing this. So here is a very detailed and comprehensive uh, table on what happened when it was introduced, the number of companies, the sectors, the targets, the phases, how the caps are determined, the point of regulation, allocation, average prices. And I'm very happy that this entire table in its entirety is in the big report produced by the ADB. So this entire table has been reproduced. And my co-authors and I worked very hard, particularly a former student, Dr. Shweta Gupta, put in a lot of effort into this. So that's the thing. Again, the prices have moved up and down quite a bit. I want to just I just want to show you two slides. Kaushik, I think I'm overshooting the time, or 5 minutes. 5 minutes, okay. So I'll fast forward through a large number of slides and get to the end. So as they say, I'm writing a long letter because I don't have time to write a short letter. So I didn't have time to make a concise presentation, so I've made a long one. But just for a moment, just an important takeaway. So this is the European Union. They started trading in the system in 2005. Lots of, hiccups and ups and downs. But what you can really see here is the takeaway that by 2030, their GHG emissions are going to be 62% lower than where they were in 2005. And the EU emissions trading system has been very central in their strategy of reaching their net zero goals. So the overall net zero goal is, I think for EU is about 2050. So this is really a very interesting takeaway. The, the one takeaway of the EU is price volatility. So the graph that just flashed by you shows a lot of volatility in prices, and basic economics tells you that then there's a mismatch between supply and demand. And if you have excess supply, then the price goes down. If you have a excess demand, then the price shoots up. And the EU has struggled with it. So this is again, as and when India has a very full-blown, sophisticated system, it must have some way to manage this price volatility. And all that this slide tells you is that the European Union created this kind of reserve, market stability reserve, where you can put in allowances when the prices are too low, and you can release allowances when the prices are high. So how the EU ETS, because it is a sophisticated market, it has been there for a long time. So for them, these are probably second order issues. The first order issues I mentioned were monitoring, reporting, what is being covered, and so on. But this is a sort of a second order issue. And as you can see, the overall history is that EU prices were low, almost zero. Now they are fairly high, in the ballpark of about 100 euros per ton. I'm going to skip through this, and maybe I'll just show you so I'll probably just show you these 3 slides, which I think should be enough to to sum up everything. So the key design issues, particularly now that we're talking about India and what India could learn, is the objectives is obvious, and the overall objective is also fairly obvious, that we are all committed to net zero, whether it's 2070, 2060, 2050. So if our overall objective is to become net zero, what role does emissions trading play in this? So the current and evolving emissions profile, how much emissions reduce, the rate at which to decarbonize the economy, who will be the participants. Of course, it has positive co-benefits. As I've already mentioned, the incidence and distribution of costs, the allocation plan, who gets how much, national circumstances, everybody is different. There are trade and competitiveness concerns, and then policy interactions. So emissions trading doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are already policies promoting renewables. There are policies, there may be taxes. So, various energy sectors are being heavily taxed. So there are interactions. In a textbook, emissions trading system is just parachuted in, but in the real world, it doesn't happen that way. And again, the whole idea about the distribution comes up. And if you want a cookbook on how to implement it, there is this cookbook. Well, it's a very important manual that has been developed, which really has these 9 steps. So you have to engage stakeholders, which is very important. Which are communicate and build capacities. You have to decide the scope of the system. You have to decide the cap. You have to distribute the allowances. Make sure the market is working well. Ensure MRV. Consider the use of offsets. Consider linking. Linking means connecting systems across countries, right? And then implement, evaluate, and approve. So these are the key steps. The key questions: what makes a system successful? What factors lead to a successful or failed intermediate policy outcome? And the lessons learned. So beyond this, what we do is we develop a very elaborate assessment framework. And don't want to get into all the details, but in our assessment framework, we look at these different criteria, and then we define them, we develop indicators, then we apply these indicators to each and every emissions trading system. So that's really the huge amount of effort that goes into it. So sorry, the report is available online, so please take a look at it. Then I think these are the last 2 slides, which are again fairly obvious. Consultations, homegrown capacity, complementary regulations. Then there are, various things like volatility, boom and bust, which leads to excess supply or excess demand. And then my concluding thoughts, again, fairly obvious. Obviously, I'm here talking about emissions trading because I do believe that it's a very important tool to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to have a country achieve its net zero goals. But as a professor, but now also as a policy practitioner, one must realize that the textbook, in a way, should be thrown away, though that's not really the right word to use. But the idea is that, the textbook ETS and the real world ETS is very different. And it's always very interesting for me as an academic come policy practitioner to see how the textbook has to be modified. And then, obviously the political economy that I've been hinting at is very important, right? The buy-in. So are the unions going to start protesting? Are consumer groups going to start protesting? So that is really important. So sorry, that's a long and a short presentation. So
this was a lot to take in 20 minutes. So as a good moderator, what I'm going to try and do is come up with a funny anecdote while you absorb all of this information and think up of what questions you want to pose at Professor Gupta. So first things first, I mean, he must have had hundreds of students kind of pass through his classes, but I have had only one environmental economics professor. So a much more significant and pivotal role that he's played in my career. And for whatever it's worth, it still can't be Shrikant for me. It'll always be Professor Gupta. And I've taken up this job just about 3.5, 4 months back, day one, again, sitting here, going through all the work that Epic does. Pollution markets is a very big part of that. And it reminded me of the first day I'm sitting in Professor Gupta's class, where we are going through one of these significant textbooks, Bamola Notes. And I kind of asked all my colleagues here, do we have a copy of Bamola Notes anywhere in office that we can kind of go and refer back to how pollution markets actually work? And I kind of see this LinkedIn notification pop in that he announces a retirement from the Delhi School of Economics. And this was like such a deja vu moment that, well, this was kind of meant to happen. And he had to be the first in a reintroduced series of talks at Epic India, especially kind of given the fact how central pollution markets are to our work. I was in Ahmedabad earlier this morning, trying to set up our next management market oversight committee meeting for the Surat PM market that we do. And I was in Bombay the day before, having the first management oversight market oversight committee meeting for the sulfates market that we've now introduced in Maharashtra. So this is fairly important for the work that we do in Epic India. We rely a lot on the kind of textbooks that we've used back in school, but having kind of information like this that reflects the real world operation of pollution markets is super important and helpful. The paper is of course available online. We'll very happily kind of put up the link and share that. But this is the opportunity where you can kind of get comments, quotes, information from the horse's mouth, as it were. So I'll just kind of open it up here. If there are questions, comments, just feel free, raise your hands. We'll circulate a mic and we'll take the discussion forward. I have a million things to ask him, but I don't want to kind of abuse my privilege, just the fact that I'm sitting here with a mic. But opening it up is in somewhat more democratic fashion.
Hi, sir. I'm Kundan Pandey from Mongabay, India. Basically, I was in COP and I noticed that sort of unilateral trade barriers are being discussed a lot. China, India, and they were raising the issue. And here comes the ETS that was applied in Europe in, I think, 2005. So the local carbon market emerging as a tool of a trade barrier where developing countries or underdeveloped countries are not able to access the global market. How do you see the evolution of ETS in Europe emerging as a barrier at a global level?
There are not too many questions. I can answer one-on-one.
I think we can kind of go one-on-one. This is a fairly intimate setting.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's a good question. So the idea of trade barriers is, of course, a very significant one. And you must have heard of this acronym called CBAM. India's, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So the whole, as we all know, that is, well, the Europeans say, well, that's, they are green and they don't want, imports with high carbon content, which get an unfair trade advantage and so on. So the CBAM is coming and there's a lot of concern about it. Thank you. The emissions trading system in a way is a counter to CBAM in the way that it also shows that countries which are, say, large exporters, particularly China, has already taken a lead in having it's a full-fledged emissions trading system, and it's expanding even as we speak. Expanding in terms of tightening the caps. It's expanding in terms of its coverage. They started with power, but they're bringing more industries in. So what in a way China is doing is it's pricing its carbon, and in a way that helps, well, the whole idea of pricing is to create incentives for cleaner production. So the signal that sends in a policy setting is, in my understanding, that yes, they're serious and they're moving in that direction. And so that, I think, helps when it comes to, negotiating with CBAM. So for example, again, this is just a thought of mine that if India were to have full-blown emissions trading, emissions trading system, that signals to the EU that yes, we are reducing our carbon intensity and so forth. And that in a way strengthens this negotiations when it comes to the CBAM, right? So the CBAM is being viewed as a protectionist measure. The CBAM will probably be running afoul of the WTO and so on. But that's a larger issue. Here, the point is that whatever the country's objectives are, so for example, when we say we are going to decarbonize by 2070, now there's a lot of debate whether that's too late, but then, the idea is that given our own needs and priorities, maybe that's the right time. So whatever our goals are, we are going to use carbon pricing as one of the mechanisms, along with other portfolio of policies to achieve our goal of net zero. And when it comes to the trade barriers, and now, of course, the US is also probably going to be very active in various kinds of trade barriers. It's probably, to my sense, helps in the, I just shouldn't say the optics, but it helps in showing that we are also moving in that direction. I don't know if that answers your question. But I'm really happy because I'm a great fan of Bonga Bay and I follow it very closely. So I think it's wonderful that you're here.
Thanks, Shrikant. Wonderful. I just had two questions. One is you referred to the social cost of carbon. And given that that's such a complex thing to do, I mean, do we have a good assessment of what is the social cost of carbon in India? And the second question is of a different kind. I mean, basically, given that, environment is not a state subject, but it is in India. But the states obviously are very important stakeholders in the process. How do you see the ETS when it's rolled out, the states being party to it or, contributing to it effectively?
Absolutely.
So Dr. Shaun Ray has asked some very good questions. So firstly, as far as the social cost of carbon is concerned, for sort of the layperson, it's the sort of the damage a ton of carbon causes today and into the future. So it's really the discounted value of a marginal ton of CO2 emissions. There are actually lots of estimates available. And there have been lots of studies, lots of models are being used to understand this. And if you have a sort of a cooperative outcome, then you have a uniform, globally harmonized price of carbon, which is certainly going to be very, very high than the numbers I flashed on the screen. There are also models that tell you regional social costs of carbon, so for India and so forth. So there is a lot of sort of ways, there are a lot of numbers available, and the numbers are very high. You can take a ballpark figure of $70, $80, $100. Every day new papers are written, which just call for higher and higher social cost of carbon. Now that's like an aspiration. You suddenly can't start pricing carbon from $0 to $200 or whatever. But those are like what again the textbook tells us, that this is what should be the price. So there is a lot of information available on it. The federalism is again a very important issue, that India has a federal structure, and how this will play out. A very good question. It all depends on the sectors that you cover and the players that you cover. So for example, a very significant part of our power generation is with things like NTPC. So there has been some discussion earlier, long back, about the NTPC implementing some sort of an internal emissions trading system. So, so there is a large number of players, steel firms, thermal firms, which are essentially centrally in the public sector, which is centrally owned. So I think that is a question that remains to be seen, depending on how it is rolled out. I don't think maybe the audience would know more, but to my knowledge, right now, the Indian emissions trading system, the legislation is there. Firstly, it's going to be implemented by the Power Ministry, not by the Environment Ministry. So that already tells you that the main focus is the power sector. And in a way, it's a scale up of the already existing PAT system. perform, achieve, and trade, which is an efficiency system. So like if I'm more energy efficient than you, then I can somehow sell you that, it's like I told you, the Chinese system is an intensity based, So the PAT system will eventually morph into a emissions trading system in India. So it'll be like that. So already there are players that are in the system, and I think what will happen, or the way you see in the other countries, you start small. So you start largely with the power sector. I mean, those the sectors that are using fossil fuels to produce electricity, and then you take it as you go along.
Hello, Professor. I'm Parth Kumar from Center for Science and Environment, and we are closely following the Indian carbon markets and also did a recent report on that. But just to add to this anecdote, as you said, interestingly, the Indian carbon market is not planning to include the power sector in the sectors it is coming up with. It is going with the industrial sector, and I think it's a big debate that should the power sector be there or not be there. And but my main question, which I thought I would want to ask you, is how do you think this an emission trading scheme or a carbon pricing will impact a huge number of smaller players in terms of manufacturers or industries? Because in India, I think they are planning to bring 9 sectors in that. Of course, they are not obligating the smallest players in that, but a lot of them are in the supply value chains and will definitely be impacted as the carbon pricing comes in. I mean, Europe has these mechanisms like modernization fund, which have been built over 20 years or so, and now they have the fund to support. But countries, emerging economies like India and Indonesia and others are facing, much added pressure to transform even the smaller industries. So, what, in your point of view, could be a way out to support them and how they will be impacted as well? Because I'm sure there would be some sort of impact they will be facing.
That's again a good question. Particularly, remember I talked about the distributional impacts, and distributional impacts are not just for consumers, which will be in the case of electricity. So in Korea, for example, when energy prices go up, then there are ways to offset it for the low income consumers. And like I've already said, in a textbook, there's this emissions trading and that's it. But here you have lots of complementary, maybe even conflicting policies. So you have subsidies for renewables, you may have price support. And before I answer your question, let me give you the example of Kazakhstan, because that's a very interesting country. And I've lived there and also, of course, looked at it in terms of this emissions trading. The Kazakh economy is very interesting. As you know, it's a formerly centrally planned economy. So as I joke, its sort of tail is in the Soviet era and its face is in the market era. Lots of the energy is used there either for producing electricity or district heating, because it's a very cold country. So what you do is you have centralized boilers where you heat the water and you supply it to houses. It's called district heating. And most of these plants and technologies are extremely old, extremely polluting, and they're mostly regulated. So the prices are regulated. So you have this double whammy. You bring in this emissions trading, but the sector is very regulated. So if the prices increase, you're not able to pass them on. So Kazakhstan is a very interesting case where the emissions trading system actually didn't work very well and they had to stop it because there was so much opposition from consumers, from industry lobbies, as you're saying. They all one fine morning said, sorry, we're not going to have it. Then they started it. So stops and starts. So unless you're rightly pointing out, unless you take into account all these issues. So as far as consumers are concerned, some way to insulate them from the shock, right? Now, when it comes to the producers, the small producers, a couple of issues. One is how do you allocate these allowances? And typically, you can either give them away free, right? Which earlier was called grandfathering. Now they more politically correct, they call it grandparenting. So grandparenting, Americanism to say you're giving it away free. So you can either give them away free based on some benchmark, or you can auction them, or you can do a combination of both. So the first thing would be that, and the reason why emissions trading sometimes is more politically acceptable to industries is because you're getting the allowances free, which is called the grandfathering approach. Then, of course, when you grandfather, what's really happening is that you grandfather, but your costs go up, then you have to increase your prices. So then, what happens is whether your firm becomes uncompetitive or not is a question. So, for example, that's what's happening in EU, right? Because now they say that we are going green and if India or China is not that way, then your goods are cheaper. So then that becomes a question of industry structure. Is it a competitive market? What kinds of things are happening? How are these competitiveness concerns going to happen? So it's fairly complex, and you've rightly flagged. Dr. Ray pointed out to the institutional frameworks, right? Federalism. You're pointing to the fact of the incidence on consumers and producers. And I don't think there's a right answer, but yes, these are issues that are important and hopefully have to be thought through, because otherwise you'll have this sort of very abrupt parachuting. That's what happened in Kazakhstan, and then it didn't work very well.
So, given India's political economic history with industrial policy, given their current push towards manufacturing, and in my view, countries like China or the EU, whenever they've implemented ETS, it's been when they are at the tech frontier. How would ETS as an instrument compare with other alternative options like, say, the IRA in the US? How would ETS as an instrument compare with proper industrial policy push, given subsidies can, reduce emissions quicker, maybe not the most efficient way, but quicker in time and maybe much more acceptable to, the government, the public in general.
I just wanted to kind of add to that. You remember your slide on the EU ETS prices in the early years? The price had kind of crashed to like a few cents per permit. So part of the criticism at that time came that EU ETS was introduced in parallel to these other efforts like the 2020 and increasing the share of renewables in the energy mix and everything else that led to a natural decarbonization of the European economy, which decreased the demand for emission permits or CO2 permits. So in many ways, all of these kind of competing policies were leading to one of them or more than one of them becoming ineffective relative to the other. So a low EU ETS price did not necessarily mean that the economy wasn't decarbonizing. It was just that it wasn't decarbonizing because of that policy. So that particular competition between various policy alternatives is also kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Yes. So, relevant question. So see, first let's understand what emissions trading does and does not do. All that emissions trading does is, in an ideal world, it creates a price signal. Right. So, for example, the EU ETS market was, you're right, that near zero because there were too many allowances in the market. So the first thing is, if you are thinking of the market per se, then that's common sense that there's excess supply, prices will go down. So if you are going with the trading system and you are serious about signaling to producers or whoever that, look, I mean, that's common sense, right? Just a demand curve. I didn't show you, but it's like a demand curve. Countries that price energy high are more energy efficient. So the idea is that if you're serious about the price signals, then you must not be too generous in allocating. But then again, the political economy question comes in, and there is always a sort of a tendency to allocate or over allocate. So what the EU did was it struggled with this. And it had initially, the prices were nearly zero because of excess of supply. And then they tried to fix it through all these market stability reserve. Then the questions that you have raised about industrial policy. Yes, this is not the only way. In fact, what's happening is that this is one of the ways. So to some extent, it's nudging by creating some price signals. But the sort of the natural tendency for governments is to do direct policy. So, subsidize renewables, do whatever else, has to be done. But what I learned from all this work is that it's not either or. So it's not that, because see, what happens is when you create a price signal that say, it's very expensive, then you're looking for substitutes. So there the government will come up with these policies to in a way synergize. So the way I think of it is synergies. And ideally, yes, you can have a world without carbon trading and you can still promote. That's what India is doing. So many countries are doing. But you could try and do both, and you can bring in this system, because again, what this system is really doing is bringing in flexibility. So the idea is that there can be, when we keep talking about trading, who's trading? It's the firms that are trading amongst themselves, the sources of emissions. And what is being traded? That the low-cost firms can sell their permits to the high-cost firms, so they have to less. So it's not one size fits all. That's really what the textbook tells us, right? So in that sense, it's a very useful way to go about it. And in the real world, there are many other things that are happening. Some are helping, some are hurting. So it's, it's a kind of a mix. Talking about countries that are actually doing trading and which levels of economic development are, interestingly enough, in our region, for example, Indonesia, which is again like a middle income country, has started it. And of course, you can think of half full, half empty glass. So in Indonesia, they've started a very nascent emissions trading system for grid connected power plants, not the off-grid ones, because they have a lot of mining and they're using huge captive plants which are generating. So that's not in the system. But Indonesia is doing it. More interestingly, I happen to know the lead climate economist of the World Bank for the Asia region, ASEAN particularly. Thailand, Malaysia and Vietnam are moving rapidly in the direction of emissions trading. So think of it as a pilot. And in Vietnam, what I learned was that the bank has invested about $5 million, small sum, but to try and create the right environment. So these three countries for sure are launching into some variant of emissions trading. So it's not only the sort of the high income countries. Certainly they do a lot more of it, the EU, and Korea and so on. But middle income countries, emerging economies are also using markets. So a broader question is whether markets are only useful for higher income countries. Perhaps not. They can be used everywhere. So I think complementarity, the market as in principle sending signals and incentivizing GHG reduction. I think those are the sort of the points I think that I would like to emphasize.
If I can just kind of follow up on that a bit more in terms of the appropriateness of using market-based instruments, but particularly emissions trading in a context with much more limited regulatory capacity than, say, the EU or the US, where they have very extensive and well-funded and well-staffed. I mean, here, if we kind of look around with our pollution control boards, you really don't find many economists there, right? So you kind of are imagining a regulator with limited understanding of doing these kind of policy interventions, and now in such an extensive way. And I've had a lot of conversations with Professor Michael Greenstone about all of this. And I think a point that Michael kind of makes is something that I've kind of started to think about a lot more carefully, is that pollution markets or emission trading schemes in the developing world haven't been successful because they really haven't been tried out. It's almost like a tautology. But if you are able to use a market-based instrument that kind of tries to overcome the limited regulatory capacity that you have in these situations and can kind of solve for that, because you don't have to have this command and control situation where every point source or industrial source needs to be regulated individually, then it's an ideal situation. Would you kind of comment on that?
Yeah, so firstly, remember that in my initial slides, I talked about pricing in terms of carbon taxes or carbon trading. And sort of firstly, a very advanced economy such as Singapore, it's a small country, but actually it's a fairly large economy, right? Its economy is almost like $500 billion. And they are not using trading. What they're using is carbon taxes. And now they're having fairly high levels. So the point is well taken. So then I would argue that, in fact, trading is easier than implementing taxes because, in a sense, you're only targeting a fewer producers, right? So maybe a few hundred, or if you look at the numbers I had in that very busy table, you can start with that. So if you're only looking at, say, thermal plants, then those will be in the hundreds, not in the lakhs, right? So in that sense, it's easier. The second thing is, unlike local pollutants like particulate matter and so on, where, by the way, also now telemetry and remote monitoring and technology helps. And again, EPIC has done all this very interesting work in Gujarat. So for carbon trading, it's easier because as long as you know the amount of energy, coal energy that is being used, in a way, you can calculate the amount of CO2 emissions, because there's not much that you can do. You burn it, it goes up, right? So in that sense, monitoring and reporting and verifying CO2 emissions is relatively easier. I use the word relatively. And the number of entities that you have to monitor is also fewer. And that now that you have all the technologies available in remote sensing and those sorts of things, and so you, for example, I think in the SO2 or something, you put it in the stack, and then you can, in the chimney, and then you can monitor remotely. So the technologies exist. The institutional capacity obviously is always a work in progress, if may put it mildly. So those are the issues. But again, it is definitely much easier than a carbon tax, because then and that word tax is somehow, though of course I must say, like I mentioned earlier, that we already have very heavily taxed sectors. The fossil fuel sectors are usually fuel cess and coal cess and all kinds of things are there. So again, we have to bear in mind that a carbon market is not coming into a sort of a greenfield thing. There's already a mess of things in place, and it's kind of being overlaid. So it just makes it more interesting. But yes, I think trading, carbon markets, carbon trading is obviously fewer places to regulate, easier in manner of speaking. And if you want to think about it, think about, say, income taxes, right? There are a few crore income tax payers, right? But somehow we do manage, people report, there may be random audits and, those sorts of things. So there's a very big literature on monitoring and enforcement, and particularly of the taxation system. So I would then just, heuristically say, well, if we can have crores of people paying income taxes and somehow manage to make it work, maybe not perfectly, then maybe the system can also work.
I mean, if I wanted to kind of have one takeaway, bottom line from the session today is that emissions trading is much easier than carbon taxes, and that's the way we should go. But not wanting to kind of just finish there, if there are any more questions, comments.
Okay, thank you, Professor Gupta. I had one question, which parts. One been asked by the previous person. So I am Upendra from AEEE, Alliance for Energy Efficient Economy, and we're also working on some policy work which has to do with decarbonization. One piece of which we're working with Niti Aayog, so which is about decarbonizing the built environment, and we're building a roadmap. And the another is the ESCO space. I was speaking to Kaushik about it, and one question that I keep asking is that how can we think more uniquely for India? I think your presentation also, in your concluding thoughts, the number 2 point was about accounting for the uniqueness of the socio-cultural context or the interest. We're looking at India, which has very different political economy. Things are more spontaneous, bottom up. Disorganized, informality is high, and there's a lot of characteristics. I'm sure you know more about it. So I've heard ETS is one, taxation or fiscal policy and regulatory measures. Since you're in academia, I want to pick your brain and ask that, are we able to think beyond these measures? We're talking about a big, large scale change, basically. That is what we want to achieve. And these are a few methods. So is there an alternative imagination for a very unique country like India? Like a lot of Europe has its own journey. I'm sure US is doing what it does. We have China as an example. This land has a very unique context. Are we thinking uniquely about it?
Yes, I mean, it's a very difficult question because we are different yet we are similar. And in a way, I think, I would argue that, look, if we are so unique, then we have nothing to learn from others, And sometimes that is, of course, the way we talk about things, oh, well, China is very regimented. The US, well, it's rich from many, many years. And oh, Singapore, but that's too small a country. In that sense, everybody is unique. And so then there are really no takeaways, So the point is, there are takeaways, accepting the fact that there are specific differences. There are certain broad ideas that probably should be taken. And, so the word learning, as I said, is probably very normative. But to see what the other parts of the world are doing, and if I may be allowed to digress, because I've lived and worked in Singapore for many years, it's a small country, but it's remarkably successful. Now, of course, I'm not saying that, again, it's a little dot and, it really can't be replicated for India, but they have a very interesting saying there that they are not, is this capitalism? Is this socialism? Is this something? Our only ism is pragmatism. And they take whatever works from all over the world and use it. So I think when you're thinking of pragmatism, I think the point there is we are different, but we look around us and see what's happening and just imbibe it. So we don't become doctrinaire that we must be socialism or capitalism or communism or whatever, right? So in that sense, I think there are important takeaways. And the takeaway that I'm trying to discuss here is that, yes, the whole broad idea that there must be some sort of pricing. And that pricing ideally could happen through pollution markets or carbon markets more than through taxes, because taxes are top down. The government announces a rate and then everybody has to pay. Here, the idea is it's organic. You create this market, you make the allocations, then the market throws up a price. So that's my take. And of course, when it's cognizant that there are many other policies that are there, some are confounding, some are supporting. The overall goal, the vision for all of us is, I mean, why are we here? Because climate change is a problem. We must reduce our emissions. We must reach net zero. And that the world is not on track to reach net zero. We all keep reading about it, right? And each country has declared its nationally determined contributions. And some countries are more advanced than others. And certainly India's 2070 goal is probably has to be ramped up. Because if India does net zero by 2070, then the world as a whole will never be able to achieve its 1.5 or 2 degrees. But having said that, our legitimate concerns are that, look, there must be resources, there must be financial flows and technological flows, which are not happening. So all that is there on the table. But the vision is for a decarbonized world. And there, I think everything is important. The markets are there, but they're not the only way. But they sort of guide and nudge. They create a signal. And the signal then has to be picked up. And then suppose the firm is now faced with this. It means, okay, now I want to decarbonize. I want to use a green technology. And so is the government going to give me some help in that? Or is there some way that international funds can be leveraged for that? So I think that's a sort of a very long answer to your question. But I certainly, frankly, believe there are takeaways. And that fact that, larger, well, still smaller, but reasonably big countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam are expressing a lot of interest. Even our neighbor Pakistan, if you look at the documents, want to understand what this trading is, how has it been working in different countries, and what hasn't worked. I gave you the example of Kazakhstan. For political economy reasons, in New Zealand, which has the oldest ETS in our region, 2008, New Zealand started by very boldly proclaimed that we will have all sectors, all gases. Then what happened was that methane, which is also potent greenhouse gas, CH4, which is largely produced by their dairy sector, not dairy, but sheep's, what you call the burp tax. So now for political economy reasons, the whole agricultural emissions are outside their emissions trading system. And agricultural emissions are almost half of their GHGs. So again, even in a country like that, the farmers and the sheep and all that cattle said, no, we can't be part of this. And then they said, okay, we'll have a tax. So when the government changed, And from the earlier government, now they have a conservative government, they've put it off the table. So, this is how the real world works. You win some, you lose some, and there are all these important takeaways. So we are forewarned, and we probably, ideally, we should take account. The last thing I want to say is that China, uh, uh, in terms of public policy, see how smart they were. They started with pilots. So they had 7 pilots. Some of them were regions like, Guangdong and so on. Some were city pilots like Shanghai. So they ran these pilots for, I think, almost like 7 to 10 years. And each pilot, they did different things. And they learned from all of that. And then they rolled out their national system. So to my mind, that's a very clever way of doing things. So again, is that so? For example, there's a pilot in the Gujarat, which is for the pollution markets. So I think, and given the kind of the intellectual power that is here with Epic, I think that I'm hoping that you folks will pick up these ideas and run with it. Your reach, your resources should probably be pushed in this direction as well.
No, I mean, that's a challenge and challenge well accepted. Gujarat took 15 years to get to where we are today. But now this market has been running for the last 5 years in Surat. The most amazing outcome of the market in Surat that to me is a very compelling theory of change is that the companies, the firms that were there in the market compared to people who were not there in the market, the industries that were not there in the market, saw a reduction in compliance costs or abatement costs by about 12%. Because that's what the market does, right? That's economics 101. That's what we learned in chapter 5.
Cheapest possible, huh?
Having seen firms in the market achieve cost reductions, everyone who wasn't in the market wanted to be regulated by the market. And you can't get kind of more compelling evidence than that. And that resulted in this one market in Surat now expanding to 5 markets, and GPCB now saying that we want to do it for water pollutants now. And Maharashtra saying that we don't want to do it for a cluster or a city. We want to do it for the state, including power plants. So they've identified 117 industrial units in the first instance, which include cement, steel, electricity, petchem, and refining. Essentially, everyone who consumes a liquid or a solid fuel that has a significant sulfur content, and they are going to roll this out. And we are kind of absolutely committed. I have kind of 2 colleagues who sit in the MPCB office, helping them design and run this scheme. So absolutely challenge accepted. But ideally, we'd want to kind of get to a point where now that we know how this works, now that China did it for 10 years, they've kind of worked through a lot of the problems that would arise as you were trying to set up this market. The kind of lessons that we've had from EU ETS, we've kind of at least tried to figure out what challenges, barriers come out, whether they are related to the political economy, the equity issues, social costs of carbon. And that's where when to me personally, a policymaker or a regulator says that we can't do it in India or any particular location because we are so exceptionally unique, I mean, to me, that just sounds lazy. You can kind of do it much faster than was done the first time around when the wheel was invented the first time around. And I'm sure it took them kind of much longer than we do this now. And I'm sure as we go forward, this can become a plug and play model with work that exists now. You can kind of roll out these markets much more efficiently and faster. I'd give you last minute to kind of any concluding remarks or thoughts that you might have, and then invite everyone to join us for some little snacks and drink or 2 that we have outside.
No really concluding remarks, except that if I want to, as an economist / policymaker, say that, emissions, markets is an idea whose time has really come. And in our region itself, in the Asian Pacific, it's being used extensively. I've given you some of these examples. So, and particularly if we are thinking of the other, we are now the 2nd largest economy in Asia, maybe Japan. So, we are really amongst the top 5, 6 economies of the world. And if we really are in that league, and if we are seeing a country like China moving in this direction, of course, very different political system, but in a way ironic, because if you think of a very centralized political system and still, being very active with markets. And I think there, for example, Professor Greenstone has done a lot of work on local pollution in China and shown how China has been successful. And it's not only just the sort of, to use the Hindi word, danda, it's many interesting things they've done. And particularly in emissions trading for greenhouse gases, the way they did it, the way they rolled out. And again, it's not perfect, but it's there and they're much ahead of us. So I think we have to sort of, we have to hasten. We have to hasten, of course, keeping in mind that we have our unique circumstances, which we should also take into account. But broadly, we must, I think, we should embrace this idea. The legislation exists, but I'm not very sure. Maybe people know more, you may know more about what's exactly happening. I don't think a lot is happening right now. And then the nudging and all from very important places like this is probably very useful. So I would simply say that there are, in our region, there are important lessons and takeaways, and it's up to us whether we want to use them or not.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. This was really delightful. I'm so glad that we could make this work and you were able to make it despite Delhi transport and traffic and everything else that was kind of trying to keep you away. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this really insightful and wonderful discussion. I particularly want to call out a few of our colleagues who've been instrumental in getting this done, having us kind of set up this session and this really engaging discussion. Shruti, who's been central to helping us figure out what we can do, how we can do it, and working with Professor Gupta and me and kind of figuring out exactly how we will have this really engaging discussion without having to go through 50 slides. Ashirbaz, Shrutikanta, Vikram, I can't see Vikram anywhere. There he is. Everyone who's kind of been so helpful in making sure that we've had the logistics and the systems in place. Animesh and everyone at the UCT Trust who's helped us organize and put all the logistics in place is a very important part, because you can't have conversations like this without at least something savory or sweet at the end of it.